Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. All right, friends and familiars. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, I have a writer of horrifying prose that explores themes of addiction, obsession, and the blurred lines between the supernatural and psychological. He's joining me today to discuss his recent novel, Shelter for the Damned. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Mike Thorn. All right, friends and familiars, we are live on YouTube and Twitch. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 9th day of August 2024. I came across your work on Bookstagram, and my interest was piqued by the cover, title, and the premise of a house that was not only haunted, but predatory. The story was supernatural, but also psychological, and those lines were continuously blurred, keeping the reader questioning the narrative as well as their own perception of it. So I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you coming on the show today.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, let's see. First question I had for you, we're going to start off kind of giving a little summary of how the book begins. It's about a young man named Mark who, along with his friends, is wandering around looking for a place to hang out and smoke cigarettes. They happen upon a house that appears to be more of a shack, but notice that it seems to have a strange presence about it. They can't quite describe its appearance accurately, and it's as though it's a living, breathing entity. Mark enters the house first, followed by his friends Scott and Adam. Immediately, Mark feels as though he wants to immerse himself in the being of the house and never leave. And that is where the story begins. And so he's drawn to it because it makes him feel better. It kind of gets him out of his current state. Each of the boys has their own set of problems. What was it about Mark that kind of sucked him into the being of this shack?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I would answer it similarly to the question, why is it that when some people have their first sip of beer, it's perfectly fine and they're able to have a beer or two and enjoy it, and they know when they've had enough and when to stop. And then the other people, the first time they have a sip of beer, something happens that is maybe more heightened and that becomes problematic. Okay, yeah. So So to me, that's part of what I was thinking about with this book was this notion of how to explore addiction through the kind of genre imagery of horror, and I see that as there's something of an addictive quality to Mark's relationship with the shack, and he has that. And his other friends are fortunate enough not to. It's like a kind of dispositional hiccup or something like that.
Well, I can't tell you how glad I am that was kind of a theme that you were trying to convey, because I was like, if I read too much into this is going to be an awkward conversation.
No, definitely. If that's something you were picking up, that's something I was thinking about.
Well, Mark's mind and idle hands seemed to get him in trouble, and with a particular kid named Clinton, it got him a beat down. Where did this, what seemed to be a proclivity towards self-sabotage come from? And I have an idea from basically what we just talked about, but was it something inherent or was it something existential?
Yeah, I think that was something I wanted to flirt with in the novel. One of the choices I made when I wrote Shelter for the Damned was to approach Mark as a character who's sort of inscrutable in some ways. I decided not to write it in the first person because I wanted a bit of a distance between the reader and Mark. But at the same time, I knew the reader always had to be with Mark. So there was a bit of a difficult balancing act there. But certainly, I wanted to address the fact that there are these environmental factors that are causing Mark a lot of pain, a lot of anger, feelings of powerlessness, and the urge to disappear in a way. Mark is not so much someone who wants to be seen, which I think is another kind of pain. He's someone who wants to disappear. He does not want to be seen. He sort of wants to erase himself. So I think that urge manifests in some self-destructive tendencies too. And I think by virtue of the fact that he feels a little bit powerless in his home life, he kind of lashes out outside of his home and gets himself into trouble, such as with Clinton.
Yeah. So it sounds kind of like maybe, and pardon me for using metrics when it comes to art, but maybe like 70% nature, 30% nurture, perhaps.
I mean, that sounds reasonable to me. Yeah, it is difficult to quantify those things, but there's some mixture. I think maybe some readers would look at the book and say, "Oh, it's 100% nature." Maybe some people would say it's 100% nurture. I remember reading one review where someone perceived Mark as a psychopath, which is not how I see Mark. I personally feel a lot of empathy toward him, and think he's just in a lot of pain and is sort of confused and out of sorts with himself. But I mean, that's a valid reading, I guess. Once the book exists, it's not up to me to say definitively what is the truth of this character. But I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, like initially when you said that person said that they thought he was a psychopath, I was like, what? How? But I guess I can see how somebody would come to that conclusion. It's just I was so drawn in by kind of the mentality of an addict, the identification, that probably just got pushed out to the periphery. So, yeah, no, I can understand that. And speaking of nurture, Mark's mother and father were very interesting. His mother seemed to be always taking his emotional temperature as if she was very emotionally enmeshed. How did his relationship with his mother factor into his behavior, if at all? And I know I'm going full on Freud here, but tell me about your mother.
Well, yeah, there is an interesting dynamic there because I think what often manifests in a household where there's a lot of tension, there's usually someone who ends up playing the role of kind of peacekeeper or someone who tries to kind of mitigate some of the tensions among other members of the household. So I think Mark's dad takes up a lot of space, and I think his mom has learned to sort of navigate around the tensions and try to keep him from exploding. So I think she's very emotionally intuitive because she's basically had to adapt to be that way. And that's probably something she had learned earlier in life as well. Often when people end up in those sorts of situations, it's something they've sort of acclimated themselves to over time, I think.
And you say his father took up a lot of space. What did you mean by that?
His father has a lot of barely latent anger, and he's a very commanding presence. So he sort of runs the household, and he makes it clear that he runs the household. And Mark, I think, bumps up against that. Mark is sort of sensitive. He's also going through a period in his life where he's going through a lot of change and feeling a lot of confusion, and that's coming out in problematic ways. And that makes his father angry because his father likes order and control. And I think that's one of the motifs you see in the book is attempts to kind of impose order on people and things that can't be done. I mean, I think that's usually a fool's errand to try to impose order on people. I think it's in Mark's case, it's part of what causes a lot of the issues.
Yeah, it's funny. The way you wrote his father was so strange because the way it came off to me is he's kind of like this happy-go-lucky guy on the surface, like, drinking from the tap. And now, which one was Scott? Or, whichever, I forget which friend he was asking about. He's like, which one? And they're like ignoring him. He's like, no, seriously, which one? And, but he's got like this threatening potential for violence lurking underneath the surface. Like he goes from happy-go-lucky to Mark just quivering because he's like, I don't know what's going to happen, from, I guess, some previous experiences. So he takes up a lot of space. I guess I understand. What was the relationship between him and his mom like? I mean, was there like abuse going on in the background?
Yeah, that's something I thought a lot about when I was first working on the novel, writing the first draft, is how much did I want to show what's happening behind closed doors. And I think by writing the book in a kind of close third style, I made the choice ultimately to only show things as Mark sees them. And even still, we get a little bit of abstraction around that and a little bit of inscrutability. I certainly wanted to imply that there's a potential there, that there has been violence. And certainly Mark is conscious of that constant threat of violence. But again, I think Mark's mom has she knows her husband well enough to know, okay, there are certain ways I have to manage this person's proclivities, this person's anger, this person's rage, this person's constantly simmering tension. So yeah, I think I left that intentionally ambiguous, although I think it's absolutely a possibility that that's something happening behind closed doors that Mark probably senses. He knows there's something happening, but he also feels kind of shut out from that world in a way.
Yeah, sort of kind of loosely like that list of archetypes that makes up the dysfunctional family. Like a lot of times the mother is like the martyr. She's the one, the peacekeeper walking on eggshells. Then you've got the addict or the dysfunctional violent person can be the father. And then the kids usually turn into the clown for attention, the lost child that just kind of keeps to themselves, which sounds kind of like what Mark was, I suppose. Well, as we go down the line to Adam's parents, we find that Adam's dad, whoever that reader was you were talking, I'd like to know what she thought about him. I thought Adam's dad is a bit of a psychopath. He's constantly either jokingly or seriously offering the kids booze while being half in the bag himself. And he physically beats Adam, and if I remember correctly, beats his mother as well. Adam's mother, not his own mother. Hopefully not. Along with emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. And oddly enough, it seemed Adam had his emotions under control, at least comparatively. What made Adam so resilient?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a similar question to why do some people develop obsessive tendencies or addictive tendencies and others don't. And it's interesting you were describing these archetypes in the household. You can have two children who grow up in the same household and one of them ends up being, highly successful in normative terms, and then the other one completely disintegrates into destructive behaviors. It's sort of inexplicable, but I think in Adam's case, he basically, much like Mark's mom, learned how to navigate through that space. He learned how to keep things in check. And I think by virtue of the fact that his father does have these violent tendencies, he realized he had to be in control in order to mitigate or minimize the amount of violence or threat he was subjecting himself to. So I think that's sort of the way I see Adam anyways. But yeah, I mean, him and Scott and Mark, they all have different variations on these kind of imposing father figures. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I don't think I certainly wasn't conscious of this when I first wrote the book. But as I was working on later drafts, I realized, oh, a lot of this book is about like how men hurt each other.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's a big part of what this book is about, how men do damage to each other. And I realized this is a motif in the book. And you're not necessarily conscious of these things when you're first writing, but it became very clear to me later.
Maybe it's too personal of a question to ask, but was there anything in particular going on in your life at the time that you wrote it that you think you might have been subconsciously channeling into the writing?
It's a good question. I started writing the book a long time before it was published. So I started working on the book in my early 20s, and it wasn't published until my early 30s. It was a book that I set aside for a long time. It started out as a kind of quasi experimental prose poem thing, and then it became much more kind of relatively conventional over time. But I think starting it in my early 20s, I was probably feeling a lot of the anxiety of entering adulthood, and feeling like I didn't know where I fit in. I've always been a sensitive writer. I've always just been a highly emotionally sensitive person, and I've just been drawn to introverted ways of moving through the world. I prefer living life through movies and books and records. People tend to scare me a lot of the time. So I think that was like that was sort of born of this moment of entering young adulthood and feeling like, where the hell do I fit in?
So circling back to the book, the character of Madeline brought me back to my childhood, to that awkward age when sex isn't really yet a concrete concept. It's, just kind of this ethereal thing in your head where physical attraction is less about sex and more about the clothes they wear and the things they say. And I remember the scene in the principal's office: striped sweater, black leggings, studded choker, hair tied back. I was like, I came of age in the 90s, so I knew a lot of girls who dressed like that. When did you come of age, and is this reminiscent of that period?
Yeah, so it's interesting. As I was, again, working through late drafts of the novel, I had an editor at Journal Stone kind of raise the question of, why do these kids not have cell phones? Why are there, where is all of the, Instagram and TikTok stuff? And it became clear, this book is about like the suburbs that I remember. And so it's set in the early 2000s, and you still see kind of some of the carryover from the 90s in the early 2000s. So yeah, I would say I was drawing on the things I remembered from that era. I was born in 1990, so I remember a bit of the 90s, certainly the late 90s.
I am old as shit.
So I'm starting to feel some of that at times too, but I mean, it's crazy how fast time goes.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Well, what does writing about that particular time period do for you emotionally? Is it enjoyable, or is there some catharsis in it?
Probably a bit of both. Yeah. I mean, I think it's largely an impulse just to write what you know as well as you can. My second novel, which I recently finished, is also focused on teenagers, and it's set in contemporary times. And I found I had to do a lot more sort of research into like the most popular social media platforms and like what would it be like to be a teenager right now. And I think there's probably been so much accelerated change, especially in the 21st century, for what teenage life looks like. Like, there weren't smartphones on school grounds when I was in high school. Barely even. There were flip phones near the very end, but phones weren't really a presence. So I think it's largely the reason I decided to write in that time is just like, that's what I know. That's what I remember. So I felt like I could capture it maybe more convincingly.
Gotcha. Yeah, the internet was an absolute juggernaut, and currently now AI is, I imagine it's going to be even more intense than the internet itself. It's getting crazy.
Truly. Yeah. Yeah, I know. It just seems like a very Prometheus sort of thing.
Yes, like we took fire from the gods for AI. I mean, the internet is great, but really it's just making the sharing of information easy. AI is just like, if we're not careful, bad things are going to happen. I mean, I don't think it's being conspiracy minded or just being out there to think that the fact that our entire infrastructure runs on computers and we have to worry about nefarious people using viruses to hijack information and holding it for ransom and stuff like that AGI, what is it, artificial general intelligence, which has the ability to innovate, couldn't just become sentient in a way and decide it's going to lock it down because we don't know what we're doing. Like, no, I can handle this better than you.
I know. It's like we don't learn or something.
Yeah. Well, as the story progresses, the Shack begins to do things that makes Mark question his sanity. And I was wondering if you knew whether what was tormenting him, which was whether that was supernatural or psychological, did you know that before writing the book, or if you left the narrative details open for either to be true and just kind of came to the conclusion at the end?
Probably both. Like, I knew for me writing it, it had to be real to me because it's real to Mark. So I'm writing the book so closely aligned with Mark's POV. It had to be real to me as a writer. Because if it wasn't real to me as a writer, I just wouldn't know how to navigate those different levels of perspective. But granted, I do think the book holds enough ambiguity to warrant the reading that this could be just a fragmented mind. This could be, at a certain point, we're just witnessing someone who has completely slipped into a different reality. And I think the book bears either reading. I think either one is equally valid. I wouldn't say either one is true, but for me as the writer, it is all real. It has to be.
Yeah. Are there any examples that you can think of where this plot device was used like really solidly? Like you spend the whole movie, the whole book, like, wait a minute, is he just like a schizophrenic, or, is this like supernatural, like demons are coming out of the wall?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a kind of a narrative device that I really like. At the time I was writing Shelter for the Damned, I was devouring a ton of Kathy Koja's fiction, and she remains one of my biggest influences and just an all around amazing person, great presence and champion in the world of fiction. So I would say Kathy Koja's books for sure, especially Bad Brains and Strange Angels come to mind. But also, Shirley Jackson's fiction often has a sort of ambiguity to it. She has a novel called Hangs a Man that ends with this sort of strangely dissociative outro. It sort of fades out, and there's this character who emerges named Tony, and it's not entirely clear whether Tony is real or not. And then The Turn of the Screw by Henry James is another just like giant novella in terms of that idea of ambiguity. I think all of those would have been books I had on my mind when I was working on Shelter for the Damned.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely is a conclusion. Don't say it, but I mean, right? I did get that right, that there is a definite answer at the end.
I mean, I've seen both interpretations, and I've heard arguments for both that are convincing to me. So to me, there's an answer. And for I'd say that the answer that you get at the end, that's true. Like I said, when I was writing it, I am seeing it all through Mark's eyes. So for me, it's all real. This is happening. This is an actual supernatural cosmic presence that is making changes in his life. But I've heard readings otherwise that I was, yeah. So sorry to,
all right. Damn
sorry
it.
if that's a disappointing answer. Yeah.
It's my eternal issue with art is I'm very detailed to a fault. It's like, dude, this is art, man. You can't like quantify it and tie it down and, put it in all these little measurements. So anyway, Well, as I mentioned earlier, Mark seemed to have a penchant for self-sabotage and got into a fight with another boy named Clinton. He apparently made a distasteful joke that had something to do with the fact that Clinton's father had just died. And I never did quite understand what exactly he said. Did I miss it somehow, or was it kept ambiguous for a reason?
Yeah, it was kept ambiguous. I wanted to convey that Mark is so kind of, he moves with such abandon that sometimes he doesn't even think. He's not thinking like, what is it that I said that set this person off? He's sort of, yeah, and I wanted a sense of kind of panic and psychological precarity throughout the book. So yeah, he says like, did I make a joke? Did I make a remark? But it all escalated so fast. And that was another thing that interested me, is how quickly a kind of banal exchange can just erupt into violence. And that's a tool I was kind of trying to use throughout the book, that there's kind of this constant present threat throughout the novel. Like there's so many banal scenes, a dinner, going to visit a friend's house, lunch break, where there's just like these kind of eruptions, you know? So that's a scene where I was playing with that.
Yeah. Apparently he said something pretty bad because he just wanted to keep kicking his ass.
Yes. He definitely upset Clinton big time.
Mm-hmm. Well, we kind of spoke about this earlier. It's very common for adolescents to experiment with drugs, and many develop a problem early on if they find that it's an effective way to escape from the angst of the beginnings of adult existence. And the way Mark pined for the shack, and when you think about it, the shack is, I don't know exactly where it was, but I remember it was kind of in an obscure open area away from the suburbs, and, it was unoccupied. He could go in and just get away from everybody and do things that are technically against the law. He could smoke when he's not supposed to, and, I'm sure do whatever else he wanted to. So was it more about addiction, or was it more about an obsession, something about the shack itself? Is it changing the way you feel, or immersion in some strange entity?
Yeah, I love that you used both of those words, because I'm very interested in the kind of the connections between the two. Obsession and addiction are they're such proximal states, and it's not uncommon that people who struggle with addiction also really struggle with obsessive tendencies or even OCD. So I was definitely interested in both obsession and addiction. And I don't know if it's possible to be addicted without being obsessed, because what is it other than obsession that has you thinking, I could really use a drink right now. I could really use a hit of whatever. Like it's a kind of obsessive thought pattern. So to me, Mark is both obsessed with and addicted to the shack and what it gives to him.
Yeah, let's see. Unlike addiction, which involves a physical or psychological need for a substance or behavior, obsession is more cognitive in nature. It often manifests as an intense preoccupation with a specific idea, person, or activity, leading to repetitive or compulsive behaviors. That sounds like the same damn thing to me, doesn't it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and addiction, it's both cognitive and physical, I guess. But I think even that is slippery. Like, I think sometimes there seems to be a lot of ambiguity around where does one begin and the other ends,
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, because there is physical, but we're not really talking about physical addiction. We're talking about wanting to change the way you feel because you don't like your current situation. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, the one thing that competed with his affection for the shack was Madeline. So was that feelings of love, or was that kind of like a cross addiction? Was it infatuation and sexual attraction that hit the same pleasure centers of the brain as a drug does? And was her influence on him ultimately positive or negative?
I think he genuinely cares about Madeline, but I think she kind of shows up in his life at a time when he's not able to connect with her the way maybe both of them wish that he could. I think they have an affinity to each other, but Mark is unable to go there. There's a scene when they're about to have an intimate encounter and he basically freaks out. He almost has a panic reaction and has to leave. I think he's just so afraid of other people that the possibilities of embracing the kind of vulnerability that he would need to have a healthy relationship with Madeline, it's just not something he possesses. So I do think the feelings are genuine and that he really cares about her. He just doesn't know how to make that work, if that makes sense.
Is it other people, or is it specifically a relationship, a romantic relationship with a female because he has mommy issues?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, he's also certainly afraid of his dad, and he has pretty fraught friendships with Scott and Adam. There's a lot of kind of antagonism between them. So I think Mark just has a difficulty connecting with people. He's just that's just an innate challenge that he has.
Well, in a particular scene, Mark is trying to get Adam to go to Scott's house, and Adam says no because Scott's parents hate him. What was it about Adam that they disliked?
Yeah, so Scott's dad is the way his particularly kind of controlling proclivities work out is that he's very fastidious about his environment being a certain way, constantly cleaning. He's even really controlling about Scott's outfits. Like he gets him to iron his shirts and he imposes a certain order on his household. And I think he sees Adam as basically like a delinquent. Adam is probably the most visibly rough around the edges out of the group. So the way I read it is that Scott's dad is probably conscious of Adam's home environment and thinks this kid is a bad influence on Scott.
So he's abusive in the sense that he's a control freak, and I'm sure very psychologically manipulative.
Yes.
A more nefarious version of Ned Flanders.
Yeah, that works.
Well, as Mark is obsessively drawn back to the shack, once they go in, there's a sound that indicates that someone is possibly in the house, or the shack, I should say. Mark goes right in against Adam and Scott's extreme protest. And something unfortunate happens to one of the boys, and Mark's reply to his one remaining friend is simply, he's gone. He also says that they can't tell anyone because no one would believe them, and worse, they may suspect that they had something to do with it. Was Mark's conclusion based on an intuitive connection with the shack, or had he become so obsessed that he didn't care what had happened to his friend and was just trying to make sure nothing would come between him and the shack?
Yeah, I think more the latter, but probably a bit of both. The shack basically consumes him, so everything else is incidental. It's like whatever the shack needs from me, I will give to it. If the shack needs to absorb the lives of my friends, if the shack needs to steal me from my family, that's fine. Like it's at this point, this haven, this kind of like ineffable escape that the shack offers me, that's more important than anything. So to me, that's what ends up governing Mark. He becomes completely obsessed. And that's where it's part of what I was interested in with this title, Shelter for the Damned. I was thinking that has a double meaning. There's a way in which the suburbs in the book can be seen as a shelter for the damned. It's like a kind of ironic title, but then the shack also, it's both quote unquote sheltering Mark, but it is also damning him. He has no way out once he enters his relationship with it.
Yeah. Well, there is a scene in the book where Mark is approached by a homeless man who very likely has an issue with drug addiction. And, we've been talking about his issues with addiction, but, in the guise of the shack. And Mark treats him with contempt and ultimately violence. So at this point, was he projecting his own issues with obsession onto the homeless man? And if not, what was his reasoning for treating the homeless man the way that he did? Because I'm thinking of myself at his age. Like, I think this particular character that you portray in the book would freak me out. I wouldn't be like contemptively telling him he's a horrible person and breaking him down emotionally and ultimately perpetrating violence towards him.
Yeah. So at this point in the book, the shack has sort of wormed its way into Mark's psyche. It gives him a feeling of power, but that power also comes with these sort of violent exertions of it. It kind of like intensifies the anger inside of him, although he initially feels like it's a shelter and a haven from all the things that are causing him pain. The shack is actually kind of magnifying them. And I do think that's precisely it. I think your reading is accurate, that he's kind of projecting things he doesn't want to recognize about himself or can't even see about himself onto this unhoused person. And that's sort of the way I saw it, which I guess I'm interested in this Jungian concept of the Jungian shadow. Like we sort of find reprehensible in others that which we can't see in ourselves, which is, I'm always trying to kind of identify when I'm doing that. If something is bothering me about someone else, I'm thinking, yeah, but is that really about me? Or, so I think that's an accurate reading for sure.
Put a pin in the Jungian shadow, because there's something I want to talk about that fits right into it. I didn't know that, that was something that you were kind of channeling into the book. So, once in the shack again, Mark comes face to face with a strange entity that conveys a somewhat ambiguous connection that it has with Mark. And this made me lean in the direction that it may not be supernatural and might be a hallucination, because, the onset of schizophrenia, I think, is like 14 to 22, I think, something like that. It usually happens in adolescence or young adulthood. And it also began to tell him to do something violent, which, schizophrenia is known for people hearing voices that tell them to harm themselves or others. So whether supernatural or psychological, were you at this point trying to imply it as a possibility to keep the reader guessing, or am I reading too much into it? And could you tell me a little bit about what the entity was attempting to convey to him?
Yeah. I don't think you're reading too much into it. I definitely wanted there to be the possibility for that reading. And again, I think that was a big part of the motivation behind my approach to the book, in leaving much of it sort of abstract, inscrutable, even the shack itself sort of being like this gray, amorphous thing. And I have read reviews that take issue with that, and maybe it was the wrong approach. But in any event, you make a decision about a book and it just seems right. And at the time, that was the way I felt and knew I had to write this book. And part of the reason for that is that I wanted this degree of ambiguity around whether it's supernatural or internal, or even cosmic. I was certainly like interested in some of the conventions of cosmic horror. Like, is the shack this entity that materializes from some other dimension? Maybe is it a portal to another dimension? I was reading people like Lovecraft and William Hope Hodgson and Algernon Blackwood, and thinking about like some of the ways they use cosmic ideas in their fiction. So yeah, and you're right. If I'm remembering correctly, this is the first moment when the shack is starting to kind of implore him to commit acts of violence. I think that's the first moment that you're describing, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, his first kind of meeting with the very, very bizarrely described entity. And I'm always impressed when, because there's kind of these generic descriptions of creatures, sometimes they're alien-like, sometimes they're animal-like, but descriptions like yours where you're like, man, where is he pulling this composition, this bodily composition from?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
But, since you brought up Jung with relation to this question, now I'm thinking like, well, is the entity an embodiment of his Jungian shadow that, Jung said the secret to individuation, as far as dealing with your shadow, is not to repress it because it'll just boil over, not to immerse yourself in it, but to integrate with it. It seems like he may have immersed himself in his shadow, if we're taking that interpretation.
I love that. I mean, I've never considered it, but I think it's very interesting because at the time I first drafted the book, I was doing my undergraduate honors thesis in large part dealing with Jung. I was reading Stephen King's novel It through Jung and Julia Kristeva. So I was thinking a lot about Jung when I was writing Shelter for the Damned. And in fact, there are these italicized moments throughout the book when I call it shack speak, when the shack is speaking to him, these sort of cryptic phrases. Mm-hmm. And I assembled those phrases out of lines that kind of resonated with me from books that were influencing Shelter for the Damned. And Jung is definitely in there. Like there are literally words from Jung in some of the shack speak. So yeah, I think that interpretation is, it's fascinating. I'd have to think about it more, but it's, I like it. Yeah.
Well, I won't go any further to make sure that I don't spoil the ending, but it was a great book. Listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. And you have a previous short story collection entitled Darkest Hours. I wanted to bring up your website here. Take a look at that. So we've got Shelter for the Damned and, well, let's go here. Fiction and poetry. Shelter for the Damned, where is it? Darkest Hours, there we go. A collection of short stories. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Darkest Hours was my first publication, book publication. It came out in 2017 originally and was reissued in 2021 by Journal Stone. The expanded edition also had a selection of horror movie reviews and essays that I wrote. So Darkest Hours is kind of widely varying in terms of the subject matter. It begins with a story about a man who develops an obsession with eating human hair. And there's another story where two professors are sitting in a house debating whether or not it's possible that there's a ghost haunting the wine cellar. And there's also a realist fiction story about a psychopath who kind of haunts this woman's life and shows up intermittently throughout her career in academia. I wrote Darkest Hours while pursuing my master's education, partially as a means of expressing some of the anxieties and fears that I felt being in the world of the academy. So there's a lot of stories about academics and academia in Darkest Hours.
Yeah, I can imagine that's pretty stressful being in the throes of masters.
Yeah, so I did my master's there. I'm doing my PhD right now. Yeah.
All righty. Well, you are a prolific short story writer, and I mean, just looking at quite a few. Have you found any common themes in your short stories?
You know, I don't really think about my own work in that way, probably because I would find it distracting. And if I get too much in my head about have I been here before or am I treading the same ground or whatever, it almost makes me too self-conscious. But probably people who have read my work, all my books, would probably notice recurring fixations. Like I do write a lot about obsession. I write a lot about anxiety, and I struggled for a long time with chronic depression on and off. So I think that shows up in my fiction in ways, but it's hard for me to say like in what ways, but mostly dark stuff, I guess. That would be the most recurring thing I notice.
Sweet.
I tend to write.
You're on the right podcast, goddammit.
Perfect.
Well, you also write poetry, and I can't think of any other way to say this. It's very technical. it seems like those are two totally different artistic skill sets. Do you consider yourself primarily one or the other, or is your drive merely to create literature regardless of whether it's poetry or prose?
I definitely see myself as a prose writer. I haven't written much poetry in a long time. Certainly haven't published any in a long time. I don't think I'm a very good poet. I made the ill-advised decision in my early 20s to do a small run of poems that I co-wrote with a friend of mine at the time. And I tried to never look at it, but I think if I were to, I would just cringe. I think I was just trying to write the most like depraved and sort of transgressive stuff that I could in poetic form. And I think it would just make me feel embarrassed now. But so fiction writer for sure.
All right. Well, you are a part of an anthology that is going to be released in October that has both poetry and prose, as well as comics. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And I was going to ask you whether you contributed poetry or prose, but it sounds like probably prose, huh?
Yes, your guess is correct. Juan Valencia, who's I've been acquainted with for a few years now, runs a great YouTube channel called Plagued by Visions. He's a really insightful reader of horror and transgressive literature. And he asked if I'd be interested in contributing to, it's a charity anthology for the Cucuapa indigenous community in Mexico. And he just said the theme is holes and voids. The title is rather provocatively, it's named Look at Our Holes. So he asked me to take that whatever direction I'd like. And I hope he likes what I wrote. I wrote this strange thing inspired by Christian mysticism and some of the weird fiction writers I was talking about earlier, like certainly Blackwood and Machen and Lovecraft, among others. So I think it comes out this fall, but I could be mistaken.
So Christian mysticism, like Gnosticism, or?
Yeah, specifically, there's a writer named Simone Weil who wrote a book called Gravity and Grace.
Gravity and Grace.
Yeah, that book just really rattled around in my brain. And this story kind of draws on that. The concept of an abyss, faith being how you have to empty yourself to allow God to reside in your body. That was just a really fascinating concept to me.
You know, there's a lot of really abstract spirituality involved in 12 steps, like when I was doing that for my addiction issues. And one of the books that they all really loved to read, and I think it was because the founder, Bill Wilson, was really into this guy, was the book was called The Sermon on the Mount, and it was about the literal Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave in the Bible, written by a guy named Emmett Fox. You ever heard of Emmett Fox?
No, I'm interested.
Yeah, I mean, I read it a long time ago, but it's kind of a mystical interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. So
fascinating. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you also have a podcast called Craftwork, and I believe you have a regular co-host as well, at least all of the episodes I saw. Yeah. Can you tell us about the show's subject matter and format?
Yeah, so it's a show I co-run with my partner, who's also a writer. Her name is Miriam Richet. We started it because we found ourselves having a lot of conversations about writing process, craft, technique. We're both interested in craft books, like how do writers think about writing? How do writers write about writing? And we know a lot of writers, and we thought it would be nice to have an excuse to kind of ask them questions about how they work. How do they approach their process? So we wanted to talk to as many different kinds of writers as possible. We've had poets and we've had noir fiction writer. Recently, we had Mark Anthony Jarman, who writes kind of like very difficult to describe. I would describe him as a sort of an experimental mixed genre writer. So yeah, we just sit down and talk to people about craft and process and technique. And it's been a lot of fun.
Well, and I looked up the acronym, so I hope I hope I've got it correct. You are a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funded doctoral candidate at the University of New Brunswick. Did I get it?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
You got it. Yeah. We usually call it shirk.
Yeah,
Shirk
I just wanted to, in case people weren't familiar with it, I wanted to just spell it out. So,
absolutely.
So it sounded like they did a number of different things financially. Is this a grant or a scholarship?
Yeah, it's a grant. So I'm funded for the 4 years of my PhD, which is all the more reason to get my ass in gear and complete in time, because I'm funded for the full 4 years. And then beyond that, it's a matter of trying to find more funding. So yeah, I was very fortunate to get that. It's a huge help.
Gotcha. Well, you are obviously a devotee of the written word based on your writing as well as obtaining your PhD in creative writing. Are you able to put into words your love of the written word? as meta as that may be?
Yeah, I mean, I've just always, it's one of those things for whatever reason. Sometimes I think of it as I don't know, like a genetic aberration or something. I've just always written and I've always read for as long as I can remember. As early as I can remember, I was just really interested in books. I just wanted to get my hands on as many as I could. I've always loved reading. I've always loved escaping into stories. I'm also like very passionate about film and I love music. So I think I just that's just the way I'm wired. There's maybe not a particularly poetic way of putting it. So, but then again, I said I am a prose writer, not a poet.
All right. We'll let you off the hook for that.
Yeah.
Well, being a lover of the written word, what is it that drew you to writing horror or just, dark content in general?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't necessarily set out thinking I am now going to write a horror story, although I've always really loved the horror genre and had a great deal of respect for it. And when I first started becoming very passionate about fiction in my adolescence, or 11, 12, 13, the writer who drew me in, as with so many people, he's in the air we breathe now, is Stephen King. So I think sometimes you discover certain writers at the right age and they just kind of nestle in your brain. I think as a writer, horror is really fun to work with because it has these kind of excesses that other genres don't have. You can use certain forms of symbolism and extreme imagery that would be a little more difficult to work into other kinds of fiction. But I guess the main answer is I've just always been drawn to and interested in dark stuff. I mean, I read everything. I certainly don't only read horror, and I think that's important for any writers to not box yourself in. But that's just what seems to come out of me when I sit at a computer to write something.
I mean, possibly, are you integrating with your shadow?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that I don't have any kind of shelter for the damned situation on my hands.
Yeah, we can't have you turning into the BTK killer.
We don't want that. No. So,
well, are you involved in any other areas of writing, like editing, ghostwriting, things like that?
I was doing some freelance copy editing for a while. I'm trying to think of when that was. I don't know, sometime in the mid 2010s. But with the PhD and everything, I don't have as much time for that. So no, it's mostly just my own writing. I mean, certainly there are writers who I exchange drafts with and who I offer notes on their material, but nothing formal in that sense. Just reading and writing an awful lot.
Well, is there a writing influence that comes to mind when you're having issues with writer's block or some other difficulty when it comes to a project you're working on that helps you push through it? And I don't know why that would be, like maybe just thinking about their accomplishments or thinking about what you know about them as an actual person from interviews, what they would do. They would push through it. They would get the job done. Anything like that?
I mean, thankfully, I happen to find writing really fun. And I think that's important to me, is that I enjoy the process. So I'm fortunate not to really run into writer's block. I find the biggest writer's block is just life. It's the stuff around writing that gets in the way of writing. Just
Not having time.
having to deal. Exactly. Yeah. Day-to-day stuff. You have to pay the bills. You have to, I don't know, work on house repairs or whatever it might be, just stuff that comes up. So for me, that's the only real writer's block, is the stuff around the writing. But I mean, certainly there are endless writers I admire and look up to. I've mentioned some of them already, but yeah, my main motivator is just that I love writing.
When you're in the middle of, your dissertation for your PhD, is that pretty much a full-time job?
Yeah, it's a full-time job. So the first chunk of your PhD, you're doing coursework, and then I co-taught an intro to literature course, and I also had an assistantship where I was editing for a journal that is run through the campus. Right now, I'm doing some research assistant work for my supervisor, and so in addition to the dissertation, I'm always doing other research. I just did a conference presentation recently. I'm going to be guest editing an issue of an academic journal in the fall. So certainly there's no shortage of work, a shortage of hours, maybe sometimes, but no shortage of work. Yeah. So the dissertation, in the context of what I'm doing, is a novel. And then I'm required to write like a 30 to 50 page introduction, kind of situating that novel within the tradition or theories that it's engaging with.
And so that's the main feature of having a PhD, is the ability to do research, right?
Certainly, or in my case, as a fiction writer, it was the ability to write another book like that. The dissertation is a novel. So I thought, this is a great opportunity to do that. But yeah, also research for sure, more so in the academic world, but I'm doing lots of research and essay writing and stuff too.
Cool. So next time you're on the show, am I going to have to refer to you as Dr. Thorn?
I mean, you certainly don't have to do anything. We'll see if I make it out of this PhD
I'll refer to you as Doctor. Doctor.
Oh, God. Yeah, if you want to embarrass me, sure. Yeah.
Well, which writer do you consider to be the most unconventional in their writing style, yet somehow brilliant?
Well, I guess I mentioned earlier, Kathy Koja has a kind of indescribable style and voice, and she can't really be pinned down to one genre. Her work is really expansive, certainly was expansive for me as a reader and as a writer. She comes to mind, but there are so many amazing writers who I love who've made a big impact on me. I mean, one of the first writers who got me excited about fiction was F. Scott Fitzgerald, who, he certainly wasn't writing horror fiction or what we think of as dark fiction, but there is something very insightful about some of the darkest of human tendencies in his work that, I can't find in anyone else's.
Speaking of addiction, he had a bit of a drinking problem.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, he did. And his work deals with that in like really profound ways. And I mean, another writer who comes to mind is Herman Melville. Moby Dick is probably my favorite novel. And that book was like postmodern, before modernism even existed. Like, that is a crazy book. That's one of the most, endlessly fascinating novels out there. So I don't know. Those are a few that come to mind.
Gotcha. Well, is there anything you do outside of reading that you feel makes you a better writer?
I think outside of reading and writing, the two things that are most important for a writer to do, to make sure they're constantly reading and writing, and reading widely. Like, I think probably an easy trap to fall into is if you're, say, a science fiction writer, to only read science fiction, or to only read contemporary fiction, or to only read fiction. I think, it's important to read widely. But the other things for me are just like, making sure you're a well-functioning person in your day-to-day life. So I think diet, sleep, and exercise. I've been vegan for over 8 years. I make sure to go to the gym regularly, to bike ride. I have a really regimented sleep schedule. So it's very important to me that I keep my mind and body in as good of shape as I can, because that's all I've got. So that's really beyond that. I can't, those are the big things.
Well, you mentioned not pigeonholing yourself into the genre that you write as far as reading is concerned. What are some of the more farther out genres that you read that are like not even close to horror?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of what the lightest stuff I read is, because I guess that I like rom-com movies. Yeah, I like a good rom-com for sure. Yeah, I definitely like rom-coms. Yeah, I like a good rom-com. I like a good comedy. Like, I love Jerry Lewis. As a kid, I was like so many kids who grew up in the 90s and 2000s. I love like Jim Carrey and Adam Sandler. So, yeah, I like my comedy. I like my romantic comedies. I read books that have like emphases on romance, but I don't think I've ever read what would be called a romance novel, although maybe I should, to see how they work. But yeah, those are I guess rom-coms would be the furthest, wouldn't they?
Yeah. I mean, in the realm of fiction anyway, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything you avoid because you feel it stifles your creativity?
I mean, I try to, like I said, I try to keep a pretty regimented sleep schedule. So that means like a fair degree of discipline. Like, I don't really, not for any particular reason, I don't really drink much, or I don't I don't smoke weed or do any, I don't know. I don't do anything that would keep me up into the late hours. I'm pretty solitary. I think that's one thing that maybe some writers find difficult to face, is that if you want to write, you do have to spend a lot of time alone. And I'm probably fortunate to just be an introvert by nature. But yeah, I think, the big thing for me is just like staying healthy. And certainly many writers have written through chaotic lives and through, drinking a lot and writing through hangovers and all that. I think that would be too difficult for me. So I just try to keep a calm, orderly life. Pretty boring.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, I'm sure it's possible to be an extrovert and a writer, but introvert is definitely beneficial. Just being in your head, that's where all the creativity takes place. And with regard to talking about having a steady sleep schedule, I've read about how circadian rhythms are extremely important to your body's just natural processes and, just general homeostasis, to make sure everything in your body is running correctly. And so I imagine that goes the same with cognitive function, and then even further than that, creativity. So
yeah, no, absolutely.
So kids, get 6 to 8 hours of sleep.
Yes, definitely. 8 if you can.
Yeah. Well, what is the most bizarre interaction you've ever had with a reader, either in person or online?
I had a very, very, very creepy interaction.
Your voice was shaking as you said that. It sounds like it's going to be intense. Holy shit.
Yeah, I got a really, really weird private message on Facebook a few years ago from someone who I didn't know. I often will just accept friend requests on Facebook if they have enough mutual friends. I don't even remember if I was Facebook friends with this person, but it seemed very kind of out there. Like, this person was maybe not entirely in our reality. And he said, "I see no good in you, you with your obsession with evil clowns and killers." And then there was a vague accusation that I had drawn on his life in my stories, that I was stealing from his life. And I looked up this person on the internet. I don't know how much I should say. I won't give any specifics, but I think I found the match, and the person had run over his ex-girlfriend with a car.
Oh, wow.
And was, I think, so that was genuinely fucking terrifying. I actually reached out to a lawyer I knew and said, like, should I report this to the police? But thankfully, it hasn't gone any further than that. But that was truly bizarre stuff. Yeah.
Wow.
I don't think I've ever talked about that in an interview. So
Yeah.
there we go.
I mean, you may want to make a police report just so it's on record. So if the dude ever shows up at your house, you can say, this is ongoing. So can you go talk to him?
Yeah. I think I responded saying, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know who you are, but it sounds like you need help, and then blocked them.
Yeah.
So
yeah, sounds like it.
Menacing.
Well, as sort of an all-encompassing kind of closing question, what is the life of Mike Thorn like outside of writing?
Mike Thorn's life is all writing. I hang out with my partner and my cat, and sometimes we go for bike rides. I live right across the street from an old growth forest, so I like getting lost in there. I'm mostly, if I'm not writing, I'm like reading or watching movies or, going to the grocery store. It's pretty much my whole life, especially now that I'm doing my PhD. That's like all I do, so, and I'm happy with that. Some people might think, oh my God, I'm like, that's bliss to me. So it's all good.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, Mike, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
You too. Thank you so much.
So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
Well, I have a website, mikethornwrites.com. I've got a couple more books coming down the chutes at some point. So pray to whatever elder god or Satan or whatever it is you pray to that ends up manifesting sooner rather than later.
Ave Satanas.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. So yeah, you can contact me through my website. All my updates are on there, and Craftwork Podcast, I guess, which is on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and some other places.
Awesome. Well, definitely stick around after we disconnect here, just so I can let you know something. But listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Mike, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Vincent.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and follow my YouTube channel so that you can watch the episodes live. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.